Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Houston Sports Talk back in the video today, and today we're going to be talking about the Dallas Mavericks potentially signing Chris Paul. Today has been reported by Bleacher Report and Mark Stein that the Dallas Mavericks have interest in three different point guards. They have interest in potentially trading for Lonzo Ball or Drew Holiday, and one guy that they're interested in potentially signing is Chris Paul. We knew before that the Mavs have very serious interest about bringing in a point guard, knowing that Kyrie Irving is expected to miss almost the first 2 months of the season. Right now, I think best scenario for this Mavericks team is Kyrie Irving comes back mid-January. Season starts around near end of October. Very well can miss almost the first 3 months of the season. Or at least 2.5 months of the season. So this Mavs team needs to add in a point guard, and we're going to be talking about Chris Paul potentially being added in. To me, I look at Chris Paul, the three guys, Drew Holiday, Lonzo Ball, Chris Paul. I look at him being the best guy that you could bring in this situation for the Dallas Mavericks. And the reason I bring this up, if you ask me who's the best player out of Chris Paul, Drew Holiday, Lonzo Ball, it is 100% Drew Holiday. But there's less trouble bringing in Chris Paul compared to Drew Holiday. Now, Drew Holiday, for one, you've got to trade for Drew Holiday. You've got to most likely probably package up both Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington. You might be able to get some draft picks back from Boston. You might be able to get a couple second-round picks back in that trade with the Celtics because you're taking on Drew Holiday's contract. But that's the thing. Drew Holiday's contract is really bad. He's a great player, but his contract is bad, and you've got to give up good players to get him. I'm not saying that it'd be terrible if they gave up PJ Washington and PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford to get Holiday, but compared to Chris Paul is a free agent. All you've got to do is sign him. And here's another problem that I think you would start to have with Chris Paul compared that you wouldn't have with Chris Paul that you could have with Drew Holiday. Now, Drew Holiday has been a starter since the 2015-16. Last time Drew Holiday was not a starter, wasn't a almost full-time starter, was the 2015-16 season in New Orleans. Now, I think one of the great reasons why Drew Holiday would be a good addition for this team is the chemistry he has with Anthony Davis, playing with Anthony Davis in New Orleans. But you can also look at the same thing with Chris Paul and say, Chris Paul played 60 games with the Warriors in the 2000, just a couple of years ago in the 2000, or just not this season, but last season, 2023-24 season, Chris Paul played with Klay Thompson as well. So maybe not as much. I mean, Anthony Davis and Holiday he played on the same team a lot more than Chris Paul and Klay Thompson did. But the thing I look at is Drew Holiday's been in that starting role all the way going back since the last 2015-16 season. He played like 67 games and started only 25. And then ever since then, sure, he's had a couple games in 70-game seasons where he comes off the bench. But, he's played since going back from the 2016-17 season to this season. Drew Holiday, he played... You look at the 2016-17 season, 67 games, 61 starts. 2017-18 season, played in 81 games, 81 starts. 2018-19 season, 67 games, 67 starts. And just look at his time in Boston, 2 years. He started in every game he's played. Milwaukee played 193 games, 185 starts. He's been a starter. And the problem is once Kyrie Irving comes back and he's healthy, does Drew Holiday go to the bench? Does Klay Thompson go to the bench? Klay Thompson last year, the Warriors started experimenting a little bit, putting him on the bench, and there would be some times Steve Kerr would put Klay on the bench, and he would actually play well off the bench for the Warriors in the 2023-24 season. Klay Thompson came off the bench 14 times. In the 2023-24 season. That was the first time he came off the bench since the 2011-12 season in Klay's rookie year. Now, but Klay started every single game for Dallas last year, though, in 72 games. Obviously, he missed 10 games last season, but every game he played, Klay was a starter. And so that, do you put Klay off the bench? But the problem would also be, you'd really have two point guards in the starting lineup. Both Kyrie and Drew Holiday are really good shooters. That helps, but they're 2 point guards. So, but with Chris Paul, just recently, he had that role of being a part-time starter when Stephen Curry wasn't available in Golden State. But when he was, Paul came off the bench. Paul played 58 games in the 2023-24 season with Golden State, and he started in 18 of those. And that was the first time Chris Paul in his career had come off the bench. And so maybe Holiday earlier in his career had more experience coming off the bench than Chris Paul did. Because Chris Paul, before this season had started in every single game he'd ever played in his career before the Golden State Warriors trade, the Jordan Poole Chris Paul trade. And, this year you saw him go to San Antonio, and he went back to that starting role, 82 games, 82 starts, 28 minutes per game, 9 points per game, almost 8 assists per game, over 1 steal per game. From 3, he shot really well this season, almost 38%. So it was a great season for Chris Paul, but I think you look at him, and he could be great in that starting role for the first couple months when Kyrie is out there. And then, I think I'd be more comfortable putting Chris Paul off the bench, with knowing he just had that role just a season ago, compared to Drew Holiday, where he hasn't had that role in going back to the 2015-16 season. Plus the fact that Chris Paul's a free agent, all you got to do is sign him. I think it would possibly be a cheaper contract to bring in Chris Paul. Meanwhile, Drew Holiday, you got to take on his bad contract, and you've probably got to give up P.J. Washington and Gafford in that deal. Now with Chris Paul, both of Gafford and Washington could stay if you sign Paul, or you could just trade those two guys for someone else. So honestly, I think Chris Paul is probably the best fit for this Mavericks team. Like I mentioned, for many reasons, the contract of it, the whole thing of once Kyrie's back, there's not this whole thing of who should come off the bench, whether it's Drew Holiday or Klay Thompson. It's just Chris Paul going to the bench. Klay remains a starter. I think if Drew Holiday was comfortable with the bench role that he knows he would have after the Kyrie return, maybe that's a different story. But you've also got to take on his bad contract. You've got to give up 2 really helpful players to your organization, in Gafford and Washington for him. Meanwhile, you could just bring in Paul, and it's cheaper, and you don't have to give up Washington and Gafford. So I think Dallas should end up, making Chris Paul their Kyrie replacement for the first couple months of the season, and then Paul just goes off the bench when Kyrie returns in January. And if you have a guy here's another thing I'll add before I end this. If you have a guy like Chris Paul, who has so much experience, I think is the most experienced point guard in the NBA. I'm not saying he's the best of all time, or I'm not saying he's if you look, who's the best point guard in this league, in history, it's Steph Curry. But who is the guy that is the most experienced, who's played the most games at the point guard position in this league? That is Chris Paul. And, maybe if there is not a Chris Paul sitting there starting at point guard, maybe Kyrie wants to rush it back and get back mid-January. But if things are going well for this Mavericks team, Chris Paul is doing a good job, maybe Kyrie can maybe slow down the rehab process a little bit and maybe shoot for an end of January or beginning of February return instead of January, so he's more ready to go for the postseason. That is another thing I will point out there for Kyrie's. Having a guy like Chris Paul, a guy who should be first ballot Hall of Famer, being the point guard for the first 2-3 months of the season, can make Kyrie's return easier, because maybe he can push that back a couple weeks or something like that, and just focus on getting right, and more rested for the playoffs if you're Kyrie. But let me know your thoughts on this potential signing for the Mavs in the comment section, and peace out.